Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, hooligan shills, desolators, peasants, vassals, gas huffers, puffers, puffers. I'm a useful idiot, and today I want to talk about a report that came out in Foreign Policy, and it's posted, and it has a bunch of interesting documents attached to it that point to the fact that the United States was very supportive of chemical warfare back when it was Iraq, using it on its own people as well as against Iran during the Iran-Iraq war during the 80s. And needless to say, this report is pretty relevant to our own times now that we're seeing a chemical weapons false flag attack perpetrated in Syria being used as the instigation, the moral obscenity, as John Kerry likes to characterize it. But of course, back in the old days when Iraq was using it against Iran and the U.S. was helping that, it wasn't a moral obscenity at all. It was a moral imperative, or immoral imperative, as it were. So as it turns out, there Iran-Iraq war, and by 1983, the Iraqi forces were already using mustard gas in the field. And the CIA knew that by 1984, they would be using nerve gas in the field, and they were. So we have chemical weapons being used by Iraq in the field on a massive scale, delivered by artillery shells, mortar shells, and aircraft in every conceivable manner. And between the years of 1983 and 1988, so 5 years solid of using a broad range of chemical weapons. And some of the other ones include tear gas, chlorine gas, arsenic, nitrogen mustard, anthrax, mycotoxins, and even unknown agents. And there are no figures for how many casualties they were on the Iranian side. Part of this is due to the fact that Iran used waves of very poorly trained, very poorly equipped, massive cannon fodder that they would put into the field against the Iraqis before the professional soldiers would come from behind. So the figures are in the tens of thousands. So you want to talk about moral obscenity. We have perhaps dozens or hundreds maybe in Syria, and this outrage feigned by our politicians. And yet during the Iraq-Iran war, tens of thousands, who knows, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 people killed by chemical weapons. And the U.S. provided logistical support and intelligence in the last 18 months of the war. So previous to that, the U.S. was aware of all these activities, but just didn't do anything about it. But by 1988, the U.S. was providing support, logistical support and intelligence to the Iraqis for massive use of chemical weapons in the year 1988. And one Air Force Colonel, Rick Francona, who is quoted heavily in this article, he was a U.S. military attaché in Baghdad in 1988, and he said, quote, "The Iraqis never told us that they intended to use nerve gas. They didn't have to. We already knew," unquote. So all these declassified documents and interviews with former intelligence officials revealed that the United States government knew all along that this was happening. In fact, the Reagan administration decided it was better to allow the attacks because they were working and Iraq was having victories in the field. And the Reagan administration, the CIA, also wagered that there would be no international repercussions. And the Soviets also used chemical weapons against the Afghans during their Afghan war, and there was no international repercussions then either. And Iran publicly alleged these illegal attacks back in the 80s and built a case for the UN. The problem is they would hand over their documentation to be presented to the UN, to the United States. So it never really went anywhere. But the country of Iran is very well aware of these events, I assure you. And one of the articles provided a little bit of history that I thought was interesting. And, the fact is that chemical weapons were first used during World War I, and that was heavy use of mustard gas, which produced generations, an entire generation that had lots of lung disease, blindness, and the like. And then apparently the Soviets used it in the 20s against rebelling peasants, and then Spain and France used it in colonial Spanish Morocco, and then Britain used it in the against in Mesopotamia, also in the 20s, and Italy also in the 20s used it in their invasion of Abyssinia, and that was under Mussolini. So the 1925 Geneva Protocol was signed, banning the use of these weapons, and then the 1997 International Treaty. So the technically the Iraq-Iran war was before the 1997 International Treaty, but needless to say, the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of the weapons, but Iraq used them, and the U.S. allowed them to. And the only interesting list of people who didn't sign to the 1997 International Treaty is Angola, North Korea, South Sudan, Syria, and oddly enough, our close ally, Egypt. So those are all the countries that feel they are legally capable of stockpiling chemical weapons, and those countries do. So anyway, other than that, other than in the 20s, before the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the Iran-Iraq war is the only massive use of chemical weapons on the battlefield before. Quite a distinction, and then of course the other distinction is the United States supported them in this. I would suggest that they probably were very curious to see how these kind of weapons would perform in the field, and just because military analysts love that kind of stuff. And let's put also in this video, last but not least, that this is also the Saddam Hussein government in Iraq that not only used chemical weapons against the armies of Iran, particularly in 1988, but also in 1988 in Halabja in northern Iraq, Kurdistan region, these chemical weapons were used on the civilian population, Kurds. And once again, it's hard to ascertain the body count. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people were killed in that chemical attack. And certainly at some point, the repercussions ended up creating a no-fly zone and a protection for the Kurdish region, and it has developed a great amount of autonomy since then. But there was that moment in 1988 in the massacre of 5,000 to 10,000 Kurds at Halabja, another forgotten massacre. And where's the moral obscenity charges then, the moral outrage? Of course, most people didn't find out about it until years later. So we have a prime example of the use of chemical weapons by a country that we now know, Iraq, and that unfortunately the U.S. was complicit. So a little bit of hypocrisy there, using this false flag event in Syria as some sort of moral outrage to justify some sort of intervention that will accomplish who knows what. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.